Hello and welcome to the Digital Debate Center. Today we're going to be talking about case debate, part 2, but we're going to specifically focus on the Taiwan affirmative. So today we're going to talk about what is a case debate, kind of give a quick refresher. We're going to talk about some tips and tricks for what we should be doing. Then we're going to talk about how we should be prosecuting the case debate in the 1NC and the 2NC/1NR. So let's talk about what a case debate is. So case debate, we have in debate on case versus off case. On case arguments are arguments made by the negative that attempt to deny the risk or minimize the risk of the opponent's advantages. So in the Taiwan affirmative, you have a China advantage, where the affirmative says that reducing arms sales to Taiwan would reduce the risk of a US-China war. Any argument that goes against that scenario is going to be a case argument, which is what we're talking about today. So we have a couple of tips for how we should prosecute the case debate. So the first thing we should do is, and we can do this for all the affirmatives that are in the packet that have been released, we want to read the 1AC. And I know you're like, well, I hear the 1AC all the time. People read it to me. Why do I need to read it? A couple of reasons. One, you want to focus on the citations. You want to say, where is this evidence from? What are the author's qualifications? When was it published? What website published it? So you can get a sense of what type of evidence the 1AC is presenting. The second thing you want to do is you want to read the parts that are not bolded and underlined, so parts that are not highlighted and are not read aloud. That way you can get a sense of, say, hey, this piece of evidence in the non-underlined portion, the part that the other team didn't read, actually says the opposite or contradicts itself or provides other useful information that helps you out. So once you've read the 1AC, we want to make analytic arguments. And analytic arguments are helpful in a couple ways. Analytic arguments meaning non-evidentiary, right? They are not cards, they are not quotes from other people. And the reason that's important is because you get to flip the script. In debate, particularly in a closed packet situation, lots of teams make the same arguments over and over and over. You aren't allowed to read your own cards, but you can make your own analytic arguments. Arguments without evidence, but that are still logical ways to contradict your opponent's scenario. And particularly when people tend to be on rails, they tend to be very locked into the same script. Breaking that script up and having some analytic arguments that are logical can really help diversify your arguments, but also catch the other team off guard. And then finally, another thing we want to do is we want to do evidence comparison. So it's not enough to say, hey, their evidence sucks, right? Their evidence isn't qualified, their evidence is old. We want to be doing comparative analysis. We want to say, not only is their evidence old, but ours is more recent. Their evidence is from a journalist from Fox News. Our evidence is from a political analyst who specializes in US-China relations, right? So we want to be doing that comparative analysis so that we can say, not only is the affirmative wrong, but we are more correct, we are better because X, Y, and Z. So how do we prosecute a case debate? We're going to start with what's called a 1NC block. Here you have my China advantage. I've set it up the way it should look on a flow. So you'll notice that we have pieces of evidence with lines under them so that we know that this Japan Times evidence is a card. And the basic scenario of this China advantage is that tensions are increasing in the Taiwan Strait, the body of water between China and Taiwan. The plan de-escalates tension because it causes Taiwan to kind of stop antagonizing China. And then if we fail to do that, there will be a US-China war. So we're the negative. We're trying to figure out how to answer this. What we're going to do is we're going to come up with a 1NC block. And a 1NC block is going to be a set of arguments that answer the case. Now you have the building blocks of that 1NC block, the components, the foundation, in the evidence packet, right? We have these two pieces of Keck evidence. Keck says there won't be a war between the US and China because of geography. Another piece of Keck evidence says there won't be a war between the US and China because of nuclear weapons, right? Their negative consequences are too big to have a war. That only answers one part of the advantage, right? All we've made are two arguments that say, hey, there's not going to be a war between the US and China. that doesn't answer the rest of this scenario. So we're going to come up with some analytic arguments. So the 1NC block, our goal is to diversify our arguments. And we also want to be efficient. Because these quotes can take quite a while to read. But an argument that just says the Japan Times evidence is old, it's from April, my evidence is more recent, very short. So let's come up with some analytic arguments that we can add to this KEKMS, and you can feel free to use these in your debate round. So the first analytic is that the Japan Times evidence in the very end says that the US must give Japan the means to defend itself. So when we were talking about evidence comparison, we were looking at warrants, right, the non-underlined portions. We were looking at author qualifications, and we were looking at time. This is an example of why it's important to read the entirety of the 1AC. So the Japan Times evidence actually concludes negative, according to a negative debater, right? Because it says that the US must give Japan the means to defend itself, so the US must continue arms sales. So now I've disputed the solvency of the affirmative, right, rather than just the impact. I can say, well, their own evidence says that arms sales are necessary, so in actuality, we need arms sales to deter China, which is what the negative disadvantage would say. So what's another argument we can make? All right, we can talk about author qualifications. So the Tay evidence is from a journalist for CNBC. Now you're like, what is CNBC? It's a business-oriented news organization. So you know who is not qualified to do political analysis? The affirmative solvency author. That's really important because we can then be comparative, right? When we start talking about the disadvantage. Their Tay evidence is from a person who specializes in business and economics. My evidence is from a military analyst who's analyzing the relative strengths and weaknesses of different countries' defensive postures or whatever. So we've talked about author qualifications. And finally, let's talk about the Lothar evidence. Lothar is writing for the Taipei Times. What is Taipei? Well, it's the capital of Taiwan. So you don't think someone from Taiwan has a political incident to hype up the threat posed by China, right? They probably do because they want the United States to send weapons. So all of these don't take too long to say. Their evidence is bad. First, the Japan Times evidence concludes negative. Second, the Tay evidence is not qualified because it's from a person specializing in business. Third, the Lothar evidence is from a Taipei-based news organization, obviously biased in favor of Taiwan. So you should prefer my impact evidence better. So we've done some pretty good work there, and it might take us 15 to 20 seconds. So what's another goal of the 1NC block that maybe we can add on here? We want to be doing comparison. So we might add an argument at the end there that says, therefore, you should prefer my evidence. Lothar evidence is from Taipei. The Keck evidence is from someone who specializes in defense policy. Therefore, my evidence is better. So we've talked about the 1NC, and we've come up with some arguments. And the good news is, once you do this, you're good to go. And why are you good to go? Because they can only read a certain number of advantages. And they can only read a certain number of advantages, then you can come up with these analytics for each one. And that maybe is 15 or 30 minutes of reading, but then you get to use that every debate. So when they say, oh, it's the China advantage, it's the Taiwan affirmative, you can say, hey, I got this. I'm going to pull out my 1 and C block. And that 1 and C block is going to allow you to diversify arguments, to be more efficient and incorporate analytics, and to do some evidence comparison. But the 2AC obviously isn't just going to take that line down. The 2AC in this instance is going to read a piece of Carpenter evidence that says that there will be war because of tensions between China and Taiwan. So these structural factors that Keck is talking about doesn't assume the current political situation. So let's talk about how we would give a 2 and C or 1 and R. Now the goal of my 2 and C or 1 and R, and I say 2 and C / 1 and R, I'll just say the block now, because we could do case debate in either one of them. Generally, however, you want to give the case debate to the 1 and R. Why? Because they have the most time to read and think out the evidence that the other team has read. They can reread from their packet, right? They can do some of that analysis so that, let's say you didn't have time beforehand to read the China advantage, but you certainly have time to read the China advantage before the 1 and R. So how are we going to give a block here? So the first thing we'll do is we're going to give an overview. And that overview should pick your best argument. Maybe I like this argument that the Japan Times evidence concludes negative. Maybe I like this Keck evidence about geography. It doesn't matter. I'm going to pick it, and then I'm going to explain why it wins me the debate. If I win that structural factors prevent a war between the US and China, and the affirmative only talks about small-scale political tension, then I win the debate because the affirmative has not proven there's a harm to the status quo. But obviously, we want to still talk about some of our arguments. So how would we extend a case argument? We go through our fancy process. And you can use this when you're extending any argument, any case argument. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to identify the argument. And we're going to identify the argument with the name and the number. Extend 1 and C1, the Keck evidence. Extend 1 and C3, the Japan Times indict, right? So we're going to call it by its name and also its number, so that the judge can clearly identify where on the flow you're at. So once we've done that, what do we do? We're going to summarize our argument. In other words, we're going to focus on the warrants of the evidence. The Keck evidence says that it is impossible to deploy troops in large enough numbers to sufficiently threaten China. So geography means that the security dilemma is between the two countries is abated. Or, judge, you need to read their Japan Times evidence. At the very bottom, it clearly says we need to sell weapons to the United States. Next, we're going to prodight our evidence. And what I mean by prodight is we're going to talk about how awesome it is. The Keck evidence is from a fellow at the Non-Proliferation Education Center. He specializes in defense policy. He's qualified to talk about nuclear weapons. Right? We want to prodight our argument. Our argument assumes historical dynamics between the US and China. Their evidence talks about a small-scale kind of flashpoint or snapshot of what's going on. Then we want to identify the counterargument. With they say. And if we want to be a little bit snarky, we can say, they just say. They just say this piece of Carpenter evidence. But, and then we want to answer the argument. we want to indict it. They just say the Carpenter evidence, but that doesn't answer the claim that my evidence made about geography. That doesn't answer the claim my evidence made about nuclear weapons being a force for peace between great powers. They just say Carpenter, but Carpenter is a hack because he's an analyst at the Cato Institute. So he's obviously funded by anti-military people or whatever. And then I want to explain, why does this matter? If they lose the Carpenter evidence, then it proves that there's no reason for the US and China to go to war. So ultimately, my goal in the 2NC and the 1NR is to pick and choose my arguments. In the 1NC, I made 5 arguments. Maybe I just picked 2. Let's say I really like this Keck evidence about nukes. I really like this indict of the Japan Times. And the way we would do that is extend 1NC to the Keck evidence, and I would explain the warrants. Historical analysis of proliferation proves that nuclear armed powers never go to war with each other because the negative consequences would be too great. It's like, okay, makes sense to me. So ultimately, what our goal is to make choices in the block. We're going to narrow down the arguments we want to go for, and we're going to focus on them. So now we've kind of figured out what we're doing here. Let's take a look at the other advantage. So remember, the China advantage says that the US and China are going to go to war because of tensions over Taiwan. But let's take a look at this other advantage, which is the relations advantage. We've got a little bit more going on here. So the relations advantage, to briefly go through it, says that the US-China relationship is at a crossroads and will weather the storm if we can maintain things like the one China policy and avoid antagonizing China. Because there's a lot of mutual benefit to cooperation. The Lopez evidence says that arms sales end up harming relations because China won't compromise on the one China policy. Then we have this third piece of evidence, which says that relationship, a strong relationship, is key to de-escalate the trade war that's going on between the two countries. And then the Steinbach evidence says that the trade war will destroy the global econ. The Courtright evidence says that the global economy is critical to global peace. Boom. That's a lot. So let's go through the same process here. So what are some analytics we can make? All right, we want to talk about author qualifications. Notice, though, that I already have a lot here, right? I have a piece of evidence that says that the US-China relationship is dead. I have 2 pieces of evidence that says that trade negotiations will fail. And then I have a piece of impact defense evidence. So some of these arguments might need to end up being saved for the block, or we can put them in the 1NC. So let's think about this Lopez piece of evidence. Lopez is once again a journalist for Business Insider. Now, does Business Insider focus on the dynamics of the US-China relationship and the importance of arms sales? No, it focuses on business. So the Lopez evidence is not qualified. Now, another thing we can think about with this advantage is that the way we get to the impact is that the US-China relationship has to get better and that we have to successfully stop the trade war. The trade war has been going on a long time. It was a key part of Donald Trump's presidency. Are we just going to suddenly stop having a trade war because we're like, oh, we're not going to sell fighter jets to Taiwan? No. So that's an argument we can make. But we can also talk about the news, because this third piece of evidence says that new negotiations are coming that will end up de-escalating the trade war, and they'll be successful. Why? Because in October, there was going to be a new round of trade negotiations that were going to work. We had to stop arms sales, though. It's November. Have we reached a trade deal with China yet? No. So this piece of evidence does not assume current events. And that's something that's really important for both of these advantages. The Japan Times evidence talks about a recent flyover that happened with Chinese jets in April. This advantage talks about negotiations that were happening in September. If we read the news, we can talk about what's happening, right? Trump is never going to back down on trade, according to a recent article I read. Recent article said that China and Trump are still at odds at the negotiating table. So then we get to the 2NC. So that's the one there. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to have our overview, and we're going to make a choice. Now, one of the things we want to do when we're making choices is it's not just going to be, what argument do I really like? That's not the goal. It's going to be, what argument is most strategic? Now, think about this relations advantage. Is it true that that China gets really angry when we sell weapons to Taiwan? Yes. Certainly true. So what's our best argument? Our best argument is probably going to be that these trade negotiations will just never, ever work. And if they are going to work, it's going to be because of domestic political pressure, not because the U.S. stopped selling weapons to Taiwan. Right? Those are compartmentalized issues. They're different issues. So if I'm making choices, right, to choose my best argument for the overview, I might choose this piece of Shalal evidence that says that there are such differing priorities in these trade negotiations that there's just no way that those negotiations will be effective. And remember, in the business of comparison, right, when I'm pro-dieting my evidence and indicting their evidence, I can talk about this piece of Schiff evidence that the AF will read in the 2AC that says that negotiations will be super effective. Guess who Schiff is? A journalist at Fox News. So obviously, Fox News is going to be biased in favor of the president. So, going through our model here, we identify the argument, extend 1NC3, the Shalal evidence. We're going to summarize it. The Shalal evidence says that U.S.-China trade negotiations are an impasse. There's no way that they'll be effective or positive. I'm going to do some comparison. Their evidence is about a round of negotiations that were supposed to take place in October. Those negotiations failed. My evidence explains why they failed because it talks about the structural reasons why the U.S. and China can't come to an agreement. And what's another argument I might choose? The truth is, U.S.-China relations have been bad for a pretty long time. So I might choose this Gunov and Seiden evidence that says that hatred of China and the view of China as being a national security threat is so fundamental to American policy that is one of the few things that has bipartisan agreement. So, for example, today, there was a big news article that broke about the FBI raiding a defense company because they were reselling Chinese military goods. And it got bipartisan praise, the raid. Why? Because if China makes the weapons for our military and we ever get a conflict with China, I'm sure those weapons probably aren't going to be as effective as we want them to be, right? There's a giant security concern, right? So the best arguments here are probably the trade negotiations won't work and U.S.-China relations are dead. But we can also do smart analytics that don't involve evidence comparison. So next level stuff here. When we read the court right evidence, it's from a study that looks at developmental factors in terms of economic development and concludes that economic development is one of the key ways to create political stability. That's probably true. But he's talking about the process of industrializing, of having more money, right? Of building political institutions, of funding a military, of having individual political power because the economy is doing well. He's not talking about the reverse, which would be a short-term shock via a global depression. So the court-right evidence is about what needs to happen in developing countries in order for them to industrialize and have a positive impact in terms of political stability and preventing civil wars. But that's not what the affirmative is talking about. The affirmative is talking about a trade war that harms US manufacturing and Chinese manufacturing. Those are not the same thing, which means that just by thinking about what the affirmative says, we can come up with reasons why their evidence doesn't apply, their evidence is bad. And those are arguments that are oftentimes the hardest to answer. So at the end of the debate, at minimum, before you go to a tournament, you should read the 1AC, you should come up with some analytics, and you should start thinking about how is my evidence better than their evidence? How are my arguments better than their arguments? And you'll do a really good job at starting to reduce the risk of the affirmative and start to win that debate. Cool. Boom.